AI, it seems like you can't escape it these days, you know? Every time you turn around, it's AI this and AI that. Pretty wild stuff, really. It's exciting, but I gotta admit, a little creepy too, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So, when you sent over all those articles about what the EU is calling their AI Act in French and English, by the way, very impressive,
Yeah,
I knew we had to really take a deep dive on this
definitely.
because this is a big deal, right? We're talking about Europe basically setting the rules, the rule book for how we develop and use AI. And what happens in Europe with tech like this, it rarely stays there, right? This could have a ripple effect everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. The EU is really trying to set the standard, the global standard, with this act.
Okay, so for anyone who maybe hasn't been glued to their newsfeed like we have, what is the EU actually trying to do here?
Well, their approach is interesting. They call it trustworthy AI, which
Yeah.
I think sums up their goal pretty well.
Trustworthy AI. See, I like that. I like that. It sounds good, right?
Yeah.
But what does that actually mean? Like in the real world, when we're talking about algorithms and lines of code, help us unpack that a bit.
Basically, they want to make sure that any AI system, anything developed or used within the EU at least, respects fundamental rights.
Okay, so human rights. Got it.
Yeah, human rights, democratic values. Oh, and this is important, the rule of law. That's a big one for them.
So it's not about stopping AI innovation altogether, but more about making sure it's used for good.
Exactly. They're not trying to slam the brakes on progress, just to steer it in a responsible direction, to
Yeah.
benefit everyone, really.
Which makes me think about, you've got all these different types of AI out there, right? From the fun stuff to the kind of scary stuff. So how does the EU deal with that? Is it like a one-size-fits-all approach?
Not at all, actually.
Yeah.
That's where their whole risk-based approach comes in. They've divided AI systems into 4 different risk categories. Each one has its own set of rules.
Okay, that makes sense. So walk us through those categories. Like what kind of AI is the EU saying is totally off limits?
Right, so at the very top, you have the unacceptable risk category. These are the AI systems that are just too dangerous. They present a clear threat to people's safety, their livelihoods, or their fundamental rights.
So we're talking super dystopian stuff here.
Pretty much. Think like social scoring systems, where
Hmm.
your every move is analyzed and you're judged by an algorithm.
Ooh, yeah, like a social credit score. Yikes.
Exactly. Or, AI systems that are designed to manipulate people emotionally or exploit their vulnerabilities. That's a hard no from the EU.
Good. No Black Mirror scenarios on their watch. I like it. So, what about the next level down? What kind of AI falls under high risk?
This is where things get really interesting. High-risk systems are those that are used in areas with a huge potential impact on our lives. Things like healthcare, transportation, education, tech, even things like how people are recruited for jobs.
Oh, wow. So, these are areas where, if the AI messes up, it could have some seriously bad consequences.
Exactly. We're talking about things like AI making critical diagnoses, controlling self-driving cars, or even shaping how kids are taught in the classroom.
Yeah. Okay. I see what you mean. High stakes indeed. So, in those cases, the EU is saying, hold on a minute. We need some serious safeguards in place.
Right. They're saying this stuff has the potential to be really beneficial, but we need to be very, very careful here.
Okay. So, with these high risk AIs, these are the ones that could really shake things up. How does the EU make sure that, companies aren't cutting corners when it comes to safety and all that?
So before any high-risk AI system can even be launched in the EU, the developers,
Mm.
they've got to go through this really rigorous approval process.
Okay, so tell me more about this process. What's involved?
Well, for starters, they need to conduct really, really thorough risk assessments. Like they need to try and anticipate any potential problems that could come up.
And not just oh yeah, we thought about that, really detailed, right?
Yeah, they got to have evidence to back it up.
Yeah.
And then, of course, they need to come up with solid mitigation strategies. Like,
Yeah.
okay, if this scenario happens, here's how we're going to prevent it from becoming a disaster, or at least try to.
Right. So it's all about planning for the worst case scenario.
Exactly. And that includes making sure that the data they're using to train these AIs is top-notch.
Oh, right, because if the data is biased or incomplete, that could lead to some pretty bad outcomes, couldn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial that the data sets are diverse,
Oh.
representative, the whole 9 yards. Otherwise, you're just baking in bias from the get-go. And we've seen where that can lead discrimination, unfair treatment, you name it. So yeah, data quality, it's a biggie. And then on top of all that, there's a ton of documentation involved. Like
Ah.
they need to keep detailed records of how they developed the AI, what data they used, what safety measures they put in place. It's pretty intense.
Wow, so it's not just about like writing good code, there's a whole other layer of responsibility and transparency involved.
Exactly. And that doesn't end once the AI is out in the wild either.
Oh, really? So it's not like a we're done, time to move on to the next project kind of thing.
Nope. Remember that term post-market monitoring we saw in one of the articles?
Yeah, it was in the Numerama one, right? It did kind of make me think of like AI police or something.
Right. It sounds a little intense, but it's actually really important. Basically, it means that companies have to keep an eye on their AI systems even after they're out there being used.
So they can't just like wash their hands of it and say, well, it's not our problem anymore.
Exactly. They have to monitor how those AIs are performing in the real world, report any incidents or problems that come up.
And what if something does go wrong? Like what if the AI starts acting up or causing harm?
Well, that's the thing. They need to be prepared to pull the plug. Like literally shut the system down if it's behaving in ways it shouldn't.
Okay, so there's a mechanism for that. Like they can't just say, well, it's too complicated, we can't turn it off now.
Nope, not anymore. The AI Act makes it clear that safety and responsibility are paramount. And speaking of responsibility, let's talk about enforcement for a second because, you've got all these different countries in the EU, all these companies developing AI. How do they actually make sure everyone's following the rules?
I mean, it does sound like a pretty massive undertaking. Who's in charge of making sure everything runs smoothly?
Well, the EU, they're not messing around here. They've actually created a whole new body specifically for this. It's called the European AI Office.
The European AI Office. Okay, so they're like the AI police?
That's one way to put it. Think of them as the AI watchdog for the entire EU. They're the ones setting the standards, overseeing the implementation of the act. But they're not doing it all alone, of course.
Right, because someone's got to actually go out there and like check that companies are following the rules.
Exactly. That's where the national authorities in each country come in. They're the ones doing the actual investigations, handing out penalties if needed, that kind of thing.
Okay, so it's a team effort. But let's be real for a sec. You know as well as I do that no law is perfect. There are always going to be people who find ways to like bend the rules or just straight up ignore them. Did the EU think about that when they were putting this act together?
They did, and that's what I think is so smart about it. They knew they couldn't predict every possible scenario, especially with technology moving as fast as it is.
Right, because what's cutting edge today is like old news tomorrow.
Exactly. So they actually designed the AI Act to be, and this is the key word, future-proof.
Future-proof. How do you even do that?
Well, they built in mechanisms that allow the act to evolve and adapt as technology changes. Like they can update the rules, add new categories, that sort of thing.
Oh, so it's not like this static document set in stone. It can actually change and keep up with the times.
Precisely. They're basically saying, we see you, AI, with all your fancy advancements, but we're ready for you. It's kind of a constantly evolving thing.
That is pretty clever, I gotta admit. But all this being said, anytime you make a big change like this, you're going to have different opinions, right? Some people are probably cheering this AI act on, while others are freaking out.
Oh, definitely. I mean, we saw it even just in the articles you shared. It's a real mixed bag of reactions.
So give us the rundown. Who's loving it, who's hating it, and who's just plain confused?
Well, on the one side, you have organizations, even governments, who are really happy about this whole thing.
And they're happy because
They're saying that the AI Act brings much-needed clarity and structure to the field, which, let's face it, can feel pretty chaotic sometimes.
I hear that.
Take the French government, for example, that piece we read from info.gov.fr. They were very clear about this. They believe that by establishing clear guidelines and rules, the AI Act will actually encourage innovation.
Okay, so they're saying that regulation in this case is actually a good thing for progress.
Exactly. Their argument is that when companies know what the rules are, they can actually relax and focus on developing good, safe, and ethical AI without worrying about suddenly getting blindsided by some new law or regulation.
That makes sense, actually. It's like, okay, here are the boundaries, now go innovate within those boundaries.
Right. But then on the other hand, you have those who are a bit more, shall we say, skeptical.
Yeah, the naysayers.
Exactly. And a lot of their concerns center around this idea that the AI Act might stifle innovation.
Because?
Well, they argue that these strict rules, while well-intentioned, might actually make it harder for European companies to compete with companies in other parts of the world where the regulations aren't as strict.
Right. Like if Europe's being super careful and other countries are just letting things rip, that could put European companies at a disadvantage, right?
That's the argument, yes. Especially when you think about those big tech giants, many of whom are not based in Europe.
Yeah, you know the ones.
Exactly. Those giants, they've got a ton of resources. They can afford to adapt to all these new rules. But for smaller companies, startups, the ones that are just getting off the ground, it could be a different story.
Yeah, I can see that, especially if it ends up being super expensive just to comply with all the regulations. You were saying earlier that there's a lot involved, risk assessments and all that.
Oh, there's a lot.
Yeah,
And all that costs time and money. So there's definitely a valid concern there. And that Numerama piece, they brought up a really interesting point. They basically said that this whole thing with the AI Act, it might actually end up benefiting those big tech companies more than anyone else.
really? How so?
Well, because they're the ones who can most easily absorb those compliance costs. The smaller players, they might struggle to keep up, which could end up, stifling competition in the long run. It's definitely something to keep an eye on as this whole thing plays out.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. It seems like the EU is walking this really fine line, trying to balance the need for innovation with the need for responsibility. It's a tough one for sure.
It is. But I think it's important to remember what this all boils down to. At the end of the day, it's about shaping the future of AI in a way that benefits everyone.
Right, because AI, it's not just some like abstract thing anymore. It's affecting our lives in very real ways.
Absolutely. It's in our phones, it's in our cars, it's even helping doctors make diagnoses.
Hmm.
So the question is, do we want to just let it develop unchecked? Or do we want to try and steer it in a direction that aligns with our values, with our hopes for the future?
Right. It's about making sure that AI serves humanity, not the other way around.
Exactly. And that's what makes this whole conversation and the EU's AI Act so incredibly important.
Well said. We're all living in this AI-powered world, whether we realize it or not. It's time to start thinking seriously about the rules of the road. And maybe, just maybe, the EU has given us a good place to start.
Absolutely.
And on that note, folks, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Big thanks to you for joining us today, and to you for sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Always a good chat.
And to all our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.